Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Riancho, and these are my wide receiver rankings for Week 15. It's the wild card round unless you got a playoff bye. It is a must-win. So there are no teams on bye. That's good news. And there are very few players injured that didn't miss last week. So that's good news. But before we get into the rankings, look at this graph. So far, the feedback from the graphs have been pretty good. No one is against them, and so we're going to keep them. So this is the last 4 games in terms of points per game on average, and obviously number 1 is way, way higher than anybody else. It's Ja'Marr Chase. No one's ever benching Ja'Marr Chase. You could argue for him as MVP. He's actually putting up more fantasy points than Saquon Barkley the last 4 games. But Joe Burrow really would be the MVP there. Ja'Marr Chase is just going to get a fat-ass contract, and he deserves it based on this type of production. So let's remove him from the equation just so we can get a more emblematic picture of the position. If anything, Ja'Marr Chase is probably going to come back closer to the rest of these players this week, and this is kind of more emblematic of where the tier breaks are. It looks like a much flatter position if we keep Ja'Marr and extend the height of this graph. So keep in mind, Ja'Marr Chase is off the screen and no one's benching him, but these next players are also in a tier of their own. Number 2 would be Puka Nacua, who went off last week, a massive game, and he is now averaging 120 yards per game. A quick turnaround against San Francisco, maybe a regression candidate as well in a tough division battle. But these next 2, they're maybe not the most obvious names, but have had some massive blow-up games. Jerry Jeudy and Jordan Addison are here also above 20.6 points per game. So I don't think you're benching them. The upside's just way too high, but they probably trickle down this list, probably get closer to like 15. That's probably a safer bet. But these next players are also still really good. Courtland Sutton is wide receiver 5 with 16.6. That might be a shocker, but an average of 87 yards per game for him and 3 touchdowns. Bo Nix always gets him the ball. With the exception of that bagel, he's been going over 10 points for the last 10 games. Courtland Sutton is money in the bank. But number 6, a player that we're welcome to have back near the top of this list is Tyreek Hill, who does have 3 touchdowns. One of them was very, very fluky off the chest of Jonnu Smith, but it still counts. So Tyreek Hill here at the top. I don't know if it's that worthy of trusting, but he gets a great matchup this week. I do like Tyreek Hill a lot. He's been playing a lot safer in fantasy last few games. But Cooper Kupp right behind him at 15.6, not a surprise, followed by JSN, who's been on a heater, tied with T. Higgins. Some great players. Just above Amon-Ra St. Brown. Last week was slightly underperforming. He was tied with Puka last week, so maybe he bounces back and he has the game Puka just had. In the fantasy playoffs, maybe it is worth a little bit more. But number 11 would be DJ Moore, who's been really solid since the offensive coordinator change in Chicago. Number 12, Jauan Jennings, also stepping up with desperation mode kicking in for the Niners. Number 13, I don't know if you trust this, but MVS still ranks top 15 with 14.5 points on average. I doubt you trust him this much, though. These next few players I think are must starts. Terry McLaurin at 14.3. Justin Jefferson and Nico Collins also above 14 points. Top 16 receivers. They feel like studs. They feel like top 10 plays every week. But number 17 and 18, a couple veterans stepping up as of late. Adam Thielen and Davante Adams come in here inside the top 20. Really productive numbers. 2 touchdowns apiece and roughly 70-ish yards for each of them. So very safe plays right now. And given their quarterback situation, how they're relying on those options, I don't see it changing. I do trust Thielen and Adams moving forward in the fantasy playoffs. Number 18, George Pickens. He's probably not going to play. Mike Tomlin sounds very doubtful and unlikely to expect him on the field. So Pickens, non-factor this week against the Eagles. Probably should have benched him in the first place. Terrible matchup. But Nick Westbrook-Ikhine still ranks top 20. A bit of a dud last week, but still has 4 touchdowns last 4 games. Could he bounce back against the Bengals? It's his coach's former team. I could see some upside still looming for NWI. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. Number 21, Keenan Allen fell back down to earth a little bit, but Jaylen Waddle has been rising. Waddle at number 22 on a bit of a heater. I think every Dolphin in that offense is valuable. If you have A-Chain, any of the 2 receivers, and Jonnu Smith, as well as Tua, actually. Tua's been also on a heater. They're all connected. those players are in desperation mode. I think they could be league winners in fantasy. If they beat the Texans this week, they have a shot to still make the playoffs. They're not going to give up. That's for sure. So Waddle, I would love to be starting right now. He's earned my trust lately. And then CeeDee Lamb, we mentioned he was a regression candidate last week, and he was outside the top 40. Now he's inside the top 25. Not as high of a riser as Justin Jefferson, but his quarterback is not as good. But CeeDee Lamb, the volume's there. You're still trusting CeeDee Lamb. Number 24, hasn't played in over 2 weeks now. Cedric Tillman, underrated asset on your bench. Maybe you don't fully trust him after missing 2 games with a concussion. You definitely prefer Jeudy, but if you've been trusting Njoku or Elijah Moore, you know that this offense is valuable. Cedric Tillman, still an interesting piece. Let's hope he's healthy. But Ladd McConkey right behind him, I do not expect to be healthy, also averaging 12.3 points per game. And then Mike Evans and Jameson Williams, both tied, hovering around 12 points per game at wide receiver 26, 27. Really, really good players. And interestingly, Mike Evans has fewer yards per game than Jamo. Jamo averaging 80 yards per game against the Bills and against the Chargers. I think you need to start both of these guys this week. I'd probably prefer Mike Evans, though, straight up. Less risk with Mike Evans. Then there's Jakobi Meyers. A.J. Brown has been a faller. 11.1 is still top 30, but we've heard some grumblings in Philadelphia. Maybe they quiet those locker room concerns. And, the best thing to do that, I'm sure they want to, give him a massive game. 2 touchdowns, 100 yards. That'll probably shut him up for a week or two. But Khalil Shakir, number 30, a staple in the top 30, always a safe floor play. And last week he did score a touchdown. Maybe that doesn't keep up, though. Against Detroit, we know there's a lot of points. So I'd still be starting Shakir. This is a very safe floor to expect from Shakir. But outside the top 30, Drake London has been a faller. Still averaging double digits, but it's only the volume, 11 plus targets. And the only other 2 players getting more are Puka Nacua and Jamar Chase. So I'm pretty concerned about the quarterback play in Atlanta. Kirk Cousins not throwing touchdowns, throwing way more interceptions instead. And while he can move the ball, London is averaging 6 catches for 78 yards per game. No touchdowns in over a month for London. I would be concerned. He's just a floor play. I don't see that touchdown ceiling available for London. But he gets the Raiders in primetime. Maybe it turns around. Then we have Brian Thomas, who is a riser. He was much lower just a week ago, and Brian Thomas is a stud. I think he could pop off this week against the Jets, who probably don't have Sauce Gardner to cover him. But then Allen Lazard, a sneaky option. Don't forget about him. He's way better than Garrett Wilson in his last 4 games, but he's been on IR. That's why it's like, what? When was the last time we saw Lazard? Last week he did play, but before that, he was popping off. So maybe against the Jags, Lazard's interesting, but Lazard is technically better, higher on this list than Marvin Harrison Jr., Josh Downs, and Malik Nabers. Maybe Lazard's more of a negative regression candidate, where those other ones probably overtake him pretty soon. But beyond Malik Nabers, we have DeAndre Hopkins, Christian Watson, and Hopkins has 2 touchdowns. Watson doesn't have a single touchdown, and they're pretty much identical the last month. So Watson's very interesting, some high upside. If he does score a touchdown, Watson could win you your week. It is possible against the Seahawks. Devon Witherspoon could lock up Jayden Reed like he did last week, but we do expect Romeo Doubs to come back soon. Maybe don't trust Watson. Hopkins is not as safe as you may think. He's the Chiefs wide receiver 1, but still only wide receiver 37 on this list. Then we have some kind of randos, wide receiver 3s, not randos, but Rome Odunze, Tim Patrick. They each had 2 touchdowns last week, so I don't know how much you trust them, but they do rank above Darnell Mooney, who's been fading. Also no touchdowns for him, just like Drake London. The volume's there. The production is over 70 yards, but he's just a floor play with no touchdowns. He's right above Ray McLeod. They're both at 9 points. So a lot of volume in that offense, but McLeod kind of caps the ceiling for London and Mooney. And then if there's no touchdowns available at all, then that sucks. Like, imagine if all of a sudden Kyle Pitts had a big game and still Kirk Cousins threw no touchdowns. If McLeod takes the volume away from London, you could get burned by a Falcons receiver. I'd be kind of concerned to start a Falcons receiver. And same goes for Davante Smith. The Eagles offense is not pass heavy at all. He has 2 touchdowns here, and he doesn't even rank top 40 at the position. So 8.9 points is a great flex play if you're starting a running back. That's like Jaylen Warren. But at wide receiver, it's kind of the no-go zone. Like, you don't really start wide receivers outside the top 40 unless it's a super deep format and you're kind of desperate. So with no teams on bye, I don't know how much you trust Devontae Smith against the Steelers this week. But I could see a big bounce back for Calvin Ridley and DK Metcalf. Neither of them have a touchdown the last month, and they feel like they're due. I would expect something to pivot. This is their floor, and if they do score a touchdown, they will go over 12 points really easily. So I could see a big game for Ridley and DK Metcalf, but they're just flex plays at the moment without that touchdown, both averaging about 60-plus yards on 7 to 8 targets, 4 to 5 catches per game. But then kind of low on this list, you wouldn't expect it. Garrett Wilson at 53, that's pretty low, but no touchdowns for him. I kind of feel like Rodgers is just going to funnel it to Adams as the season goes on. Like, what are they playing for if not like to relive the glory days and have fun? They have their own relationship. I think Garrett Wilson could kind of get cast aside for touchdowns. I could see Lazard score a lot faster than Garrett Wilson. So I don't love Garrett Wilson from a ceiling standpoint. From a floor standpoint, full PPR, still 8.5 targets for him. He's okay, but a little risky at the moment, not even top 50. Same goes for Jayden Reed and Zay Flowers, but you kind of feel like they're big regression candidates in the positive direction. Probably safer bets to bounce back than Garrett Wilson, if you ask me. But Jayden Reed was completely locked up a bagel last week. I was terribly wrong. I thought Romeo Doubs missing would help him. That was wrong. That was terrible. So apologies on Jayden Reed last week. And then Zay Flowers, it's been a while, but he's only averaging 44 yards per game the last month. The yardage has evaporated. He used to go over 100 yards a lot. It hasn't happened in quite some time. So Zay Flowers maybe bounces back against the Giants this week. Off a bye, you'd expect them to get him going. But then a few players down here I'll just bring up that are fluke options in your lineup, but shockingly rank above some big names at the bottom. Michael Pittman Jr. here, along with Demario Douglas and Quentin Johnston, all averaging around 7 points per game. And then at 6.3, we have Xavier Legette, Tank Dell. And at 6.1, we have John Mechie. To tell me that John Mechie is averaging almost identical numbers to Tank Dell in fantasy the last month is insane. I would have never expected that when I drafted Tank Dell. So I really missed on Tank Dell this season, and maybe he bounces back off the bye, but I really have no desire to trust him. It could be John Mechie behind Nico Collins. I only trust Collins and Joe Mixon at the moment. But then Romeo Doubs at 5.7, Amari Cooper at 5.6. Cooper just had 14 targets, though, and that probably really bounces back in a major way. If Keon Coleman remains injured, Amari Cooper probably contributes a lot in the shootout. So expect him to bounce back, but then right behind them is Josh Palmer, and him I kind of view like Romeo Doubs. Maybe it'll work out, but probably not. And then outside the top 80, not even 5 points per game, Deebo Samuel averaging 3.3. Holy shit. If there's anyone who's a regression candidate in a positive direction, it would be Deebo Samuel. He is due probably more than anyone on this list. So if you're willing to take a shot on Deebo, I will bring up some stats for him that may make you consider him a week winner against the Rams on Thursday. We'll see what happens. But damn, Deebo really low. And I also need to take an L on Tyler Lockett. I did tell you to bench DK Metcalf last week, but I did kind of get overzealous and rank Tyler Lockett above him based on some matchup stats. I was right. DK did not go over 7 points. He had about 6.5 roughly. Lockett, though, had a bagel, and I did expect a touchdown for Lockett. So Lockett's done. Big L for me on Lockett, but I was right to downgrade DK Metcalf. This week, I kind of do like Metcalf, but that's it for the regression candidates. I don't want to spend too much time on these charts, but we will go over the matchups real quick. These are the last 5 games and how every defense has performed against the wide receiver position, how many fantasy points they give up, and the Atlanta Falcons are clearly above everyone else. Like, there's an elite top 3, then there's a very flat tier in the top 10, but the Falcons are overwhelmingly above everyone else. So the best matchup on the week goes to the Raiders and Jakobi Meyers and Trey Tucker. I don't know how much you trust Trey Tucker. Jakobi Meyers is pretty interesting, but if anything, I'm just more confident in Brock Bowers against the Falcons this week. But next best matchup, still a pretty good upgrade. I really like the Dolphins receivers this week. The Texans have been very vulnerable to the receiver position. Their secondary, not that good this season. So Tyreek Hill, Jaylen Waddle, big upgrades. I also think Jonnu Smith has a big game as well. But next on the list might shock you. It's the Chiefs, who did give up a touchdown to Quentin Johnston last week, a decent amount of yards to Josh Palmer as well. Chiefs ranked top 3 the last 5 games, and you wouldn't expect that. Their run defense is elite. That's a big reason why teams are choosing to throw the ball instead. So actually an upgrade here for Jerry Jeudy, Cedric Tillman, and Elijah Moore. If Tillman plays, I don't know how much I trust Elijah Moore, but perhaps Jerry Jeudy on Trent McDuffie. The Chiefs know him very well. There's a chance this doesn't work out for Jerry Jeudy. But Tillman, an interesting piece at flex. But next best matchup would be the Bengals for Calvin Ridley and Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. They had a great matchup against Jacksonville last week, and it went to shit. It didn't really matter. Do you trust the Titans receivers in a bounce-back spot against a good matchup, the Bengals? I might trust Ridley. I don't know how much I trust Ikhine. That touchdown streak did end last week. The next best matchup would be Denver, who gave up a ton of yards to Jerry Jeudy, so this is kind of skewed. I don't know how much I actually trust this. Patrick Surtain is probably a tough matchup on Michael Pittman, but if he goes against Josh Downs, that's really the only fantasy receiver we trust over there. Otherwise, there are some injuries in Denver's secondary, and perhaps they are vulnerable. Josh Downs could have a good game. It is technically an upgrade, but maybe Alec Pierce, A.D. Mitchell have that touchdown instead. The Chargers have also been a good matchup. Their secondary is catching picks, but not really stopping any receivers. So Mike Evans, Jalen McMillan get an upgrade. I trust Mike Evans this week. And then the Raiders are also a pretty good matchup. So Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Ray McLeod technically get an upgrade, but I don't know how much you trust Kirk Cousins to score touchdowns. It's a Monday night game, and he's actually been much better on Monday night the last few years, but last few games, he's been terrible. Which version of Cousins are you getting? In prime time, I'm a bit worried they just lean on Bijan and Algier instead in the red zone. Buffalo, also a good matchup. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Tim Patrick probably find themselves in a shootout. I love this matchup for these Detroit Lions receivers. And then Minnesota, also top 10 matchup. DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze had a good game on them a couple weeks ago, especially DJ Moore and Keenan. Odunze kind of faded, but maybe Keenan and DJ do bounce back in a big way. The Vikings sometimes give up a lot of yards. It's in Minnesota. Will Caleb be able to play just as good in that environment? I'm a bit worried about it, but DJ Moore probably at least deserves an upgrade. Keenan, an interesting flex. I don't know how much you trust Rome, but New Orleans also an upgrade, top 10. Terry McLaurin and Noah Brown get an upgrade here off the bye. I obviously trust Terry. I don't know how much about Noah Brown. I did rank him. He's a deep-ass flyer. I doubt you're trusting him in the playoffs. But some downgrades. Let's talk about the negative matchups here. I don't know how much I trust the Niners as a big downgrade because they did shut down a rookie quarterback last week, and a desperation game did help them. And then in the snow, it's not like Josh Allen threw that many touchdowns. He caught one himself. So I didn't count that, and the snow game really impacts San Francisco. I think they're a little closer to league average, but technically they are the worst on paper at the moment. But against Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, are you really benching him? I doubt it. The Eagles are a more legit worst matchup, in my opinion. Mike Williams and Calvin Austin, I really don't trust. George Pickens, I don't expect to play. But Carolina has been a downgrade. Their run defense is terrible, so their secondary doesn't get tested as often. CeeDee Lamb, technically a downgrade. I doubt I care, though. Cooks and Turpin, I wouldn't trust. The Giants, also a downgrade, but their run defense is really bad. So against the Ravens, I think the entire Ravens offense will be playing very well. So Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, I don't know how much I downgrade them against the Giants. Arizona has been a legit downgrade overall, though. All season, the Cardinals have been tough against the pass. But Demario Douglas, Kendrick Bourne, Kayshon Boutte, don't think anyone's earned your trust in the Patriots receiving core. They trust the tight end position a lot more. In Green Bay, that's also a downgrade for JSN, DK Metcalf, and Lockett. But at home on Sunday Night Primetime, I actually see, obviously, a good game for JSN. I wouldn't downgrade JSN. Jair Alexander might miss this game. He's been banged up the last few weeks. But DK Metcalf, I think, will probably bounce back. I doubt Metcalf is held in check for that long. But another downgrade would be Washington secondary, who are adding Marshawn Lattimore this week. Against the Saints, I do not trust MVS and Cedric Wilson Jr. with Spencer Rattler at quarterback. I think that's probably the biggest downgrade I would be afraid of overall on this list. But then the Colts also technically a downgrade for Courtland Sutton, Devon Villay, Marvin Mims, Troy Franklin, and maybe Josh Reynolds returns off of the bye. Maybe Courtland Sutton does get limited for the first time in a while. But Detroit also technically a bad matchup, but I don't care about it. Probably going to be a big shootout. Khalil Shakir, Amari Cooper, and Keon Coleman should probably dominate. If Keon's out, I would definitely trust Shakir and Amari Cooper. But then the last bad matchup here would be the Steelers going up against A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. I only trust one of them. I think A.J. Brown's going to have a big game. Because of all the noise, they probably try and quiet the media and give him a big game. So I would start A.J. Brown. I probably would fade Devontae Smith heavily, though. We mentioned he was already underperforming the last month in the first place. So that was kind of a long recap. Now I'm going to get into my rankings, but I'm going to kind of talk about him from a more tier-based perspective, not get into too many nuances overall, especially at the top, where you really know who you're starting. Number one should be clear and obvious. It's Ja'Marr Chase at Tennessee. The only risk is if his former coach knows his weaknesses and how to stop him, but I wouldn't bench Ja'Marr Chase at all. No chance in hell would I do that. I'm also obviously starting Puka Nacua after such a big game. Actually, the Niners are the worst matchup on paper. Maybe you're worried, but I looked at his only game against them in his career where he played more than 50% of snaps, and Puka put up 22.2 points. Puka Nacua at wide receiver 2. That should be obvious. But then Amon-Ra St. Brown, I think, is poised for a major bounce back in a insane shootout against Buffalo. Should be a massive score from both teams. St. Brown obviously is back at the top. And then Justin Jefferson, after such a big game, maybe falls back down a little bit. Against Chicago, he doesn't play well on the road. He averages only 7.4 points per game his last 3 in Chicago against the Bears. But if you look at the last 2 games at home, he's averaging 20.4. So what turns into 37 yards per game on the road is now 131 at home. Jefferson's going to be insane. I definitely trust him. The only way it doesn't happen at this elite of a rate is if Addison has another blow up and hogs everything instead. But I wouldn't rank Addison above Jefferson. You start your studs in the playoffs. Jefferson is top 4, and I feel great to see him here. I'm a little optimistic and hopeful, and I could be wrong. He has had a few rough games, but against Houston, it's a must win. I think this is a playoff game for Miami. They're going to be in playoff mode rest of season, but this one hinges on any of their chances the rest of the way. And the last 5 games, the Texans have been the second best matchup against receivers, giving up 35 points per game, 13.2 catches on 183 yards per game, as well as 8 touchdowns the last 5 games. I really trust Tyreek to find pay dirt this week. He has 3 the last month. One of them was a little bit fluky, but still, he's a top 6 receiver in that span, and I do trust him. I think he's a top 5 play this week. You drafted him as an elite guy. If you made it into the playoffs with him, I would start him. I think Tyreek has a great game in Week 15. Number 6 and 7, I think, are clear and obvious starts. They were on bye last week, so you're dying to get them back. Terry McLaurin at the Saints. No worries there. Definitely a good spot. It's a top 10 matchup against New Orleans. Terry could score 2 touchdowns. Wouldn't shock me. But then Nico against the Dolphins, also an elite option. Not a player you're benching. Nico is one of the difference makers. He represents the bottom of this elite tier. I think anyone in the top 7 has to be in your lineup this week. I would not bench any of these wide receiver 1s at all. The next player in the top of tier 2 is technically a wide receiver 2 himself. I have T. Higgins here at Tennessee, who's been a difference maker as well. He had a rough game last week, and Ja'Marr Chase went off. Maybe in terms of regression candidates, T. Higgins could be the play. You're definitely starting T. Higgins, but at number 8, he's a top 10 receiver, not in that elite wide receiver 1 tier, because he is a wide receiver 2, and we saw the risk of that last week, but I expect to bounce back. Definitely start T. Higgins. Number 9, another wide receiver 2, definitely start Cooper Kupp, even though the matchup on paper is a downgrade for Kupp. Don't worry about it. He'll be lights out. In his last 5 games versus San Francisco, he does average 16.2 points per game, 96 yards per game. But interestingly, he has been inactive the last 3 games versus the Niners in his career. Hasn't played them since 2022. The stats I just showed you date from 2020 to 2022. Kupp has not faced off against San Francisco in a couple years. So we'll see what happens. I did pick the Niners to win on Thursday. Number 10, another veteran that I think will go off on Sunday. The Chargers are a very good matchup for Mike Evans. Love Mike Evans this week. I'll be attending this game, and I expect him to go over 100 yards and a touchdown. I think he's going to dominate on the Chargers cornerbacks. So I love Mike Evans. I think Baker plays really well. A must win for them. They need to keep winning to hold off the Falcons from catching them. So Mike Evans, a must start this week. I think he definitely gets in the end zone again. Number 11 is DJ Moore at Minnesota, and I do trust DJ Moore a lot. The matchup is top 10. The Vikings do give up 186 receiving yards per game to the position. And since DJ Moore has been a Chicago Bear, he's been really effective against Minnesota, averaging 14.9 fantasy points per game against the Vikings in 3 dating back to last season. And one of them was with Tyson Bagent. He only had like 50 yards in that game. He's gone pretty much over 100 in the last 2. On the road last year, he had 114 yards on 11 catches. And as long as the quarterback is not Tyson Bagent, then he will pay off. I do trust DJ Moore a lot in this offense. In division, I think the Bears will compete more than last week, but not win. DJ Moore, though, should be fine. I would trust DJ Moore from a yard standpoint. I think he goes close to 100 yards this week. At number 12, I have Jauan Jennings versus the Rams, and I do trust him a lot. He's been the wide receiver 12 over the last month, so this is where I rank him. DJ Moore's been the wide receiver 11, so kind of just keeping them in lockstep with their averages. But the matchup's also top 12. And in week 3, if you recall, Jauan Jennings had over 40 fantasy points, 3 touchdowns, 175 yards on 11 catches against the Rams in that loss when Deebo didn't play. Ayuk was terrible that week, and Jennings was insane with 3 touchdowns. But he also has a game with 94 yards and 2 touchdowns on them back in 2022. Week 18, he also dominated the Rams before. So he plays well against them in this rivalry. I expect him to step up. He's been the number 1 target for Brock Purdy. He had 2 touchdowns last week. I would be starting Jennings for sure. Definitely going to trust him. It's a must win. He will show up on Thursday. I'm also going to start CeeDee Lamb for sure, but the quarterback play is not the best, and this matchup does rank bottom 3. The Panthers do really limit opposing receivers, especially from a yard standpoint, only give up 114 yards per game and only 3 touchdowns the last 5 weeks. So if you had A.J. Brown last week, you understood some of the concerns. This matchup's actually pretty bad and a big downgrade, but it's CeeDee Lamb. He's getting 10 plus targets every week, and he did find the end zone last week. I still trust the volume. I think you start your studs in the playoffs. While he's not top 10 for me this week, I still think CeeDee Lamb deserves a must-start status. Number 13, I wouldn't be benching him, but I don't expect the highest ceiling for Lamb this week. You know he's diminished with Cooper Rush, and against this matchup, I do have a few concerns. But he's been the wide receiver 23 over the last month. I'm still starting CeeDee Lamb. I expect him to be better. He probably does score that touchdown. But number 14, a player that's also been fading, A.J. Brown, only ranks as wide receiver 29 the last month, 11.1 points, but I do expect to bounce back. The matchup isn't as bad against Pittsburgh, but it's not like it's good. The Steelers are still a downgrade, but with all of the noise surrounding his relationship in the locker room and everything that's going on in the media, I expect them to quiet that noise a bit. And probably the first play of the game is a bubble screen to A.J. Brown. They're going to throw him at least like 8 targets. Last week he only had 4. I think maybe justifiably he was upset. I expect that to double, at least 8 targets for A.J. Brown this week. He's only averaging 6.3 the last month. That will increase this week. So I still rank him top 15, but obviously the slump has me a bit concerned. A little touchdown dependent, and it hasn't been hitting. So A.J. Brown, last week he was tied with MVS, and he plummeted while MVS maintained top 15. I could be wrong on this, but based on name value, are you really going to bench A.J. Brown and CeeDee Lamb? I don't think so. I wouldn't do that. At number 14, I'd still start him. Number 15, I'm also going to start Courtland Sutton, who's been so productive, and off the bye, I expect it to continue. Bo Nix should make some progress, but technically it is a tough matchup against the Colts. It does rank bottom 8 against the position, so maybe it doesn't work out. I wouldn't bet against it, though. Sutton's just been so productive, averaging 16.6 points the last 4 games. That's the wide receiver 5. He's money in the bank. I don't think you can bench Sutton, but I do expect him to come down just a little bit in this game, because that's the only player you need to shut down to actually stop Denver. If you stop Courtland Sutton, what else do they have on offense? They have a good defense, but on offense, Bo Nix could be vulnerable if you actually shut down and take away Courtland Sutton. Do I expect that to completely happen? No, but to a certain degree, maybe he probably comes closer to like 12, 13 points than 16 plus, in my opinion. Number 16, the last player in this tier would be Jaxon Smith-Njigba. JSN has been so productive, the wide receiver 8 over the last month, and dating back even longer, he's been in the top 10 as well. So he's overtaken DK Metcalf. He is the wide receiver 1. As Tyler Lockett has officially completely faded, JSN is obviously the guy you want, and I would trust him in primetime against the Packers. He should go off. I want to rank him higher, honestly, but if Jair Alexander does play, that should be a slight downgrade. I would still start him no matter what. At wide receiver 16, I'm not benching JSN. Number 17, I think we're dropping down a tier, and now there is still, a bit of risk, but you're definitely starting them. I would still trust them. Lower end wide receiver 2s in this tier. But number 17 is Jerry Jeudy versus the Chiefs, and he is the wide receiver 3. Do you really trust that to repeat? It was one insane blow-up game in a revenge spot, and the last 2 weeks, including that game, Cedric Tillman has not been playing. If Tillman comes back, I imagine that impacts the target share for Jeudy. And the Chiefs know him very well from his days against them in Denver. And in 8 career games, Jerry Jeudy only has 1 touchdown. So I'm a bit concerned the touchdown does not hit for Jeudy this week, but he's been so productive, he probably still gives you at least 80 yards. And I trust Jameis to chuck it. The matchup, other than Trent McDuffie, shouldn't scare you at all. It does rank top 3 overall against receivers. They give up almost 33 fantasy points per game, and I could see 11 apiece for both Jeudy, Tillman, and Elijah Moore in this game. I'd still be starting Jerry Jeudy against the Chiefs, but not in the elite tier, more of a low end wide receiver 2, still in the top 20. I wouldn't bench him. I'm also not benching Jordan Addison versus Chicago. I don't know if 3 touchdowns are going to hit like it did last week, but against the Bears, I still think he's going to play well. In his last 3 games versus Chicago, he's averaging 14.5 points per game with 2 touchdowns in those 3 games, an average of 76 yards. He'll be fine. He probably doesn't go over 100 yards every single time, but that is part of his upside, and it wouldn't shock me if it happened again. At home, the Vikings should win comfortably. So I trust him. He had 26 points against them 2 weeks ago on 162 yards. I think Jefferson will play better this week, but Addison is on fire. You have to start him a top 20 player. Just like Jerry Jeudy, the ceiling's been too high. You have to keep him in your lineup despite a little risk. You wouldn't be shocked if there was like all of a sudden a 2-catch game for either of these players and you only got like 5-6 points. It wouldn't completely shock you. But that's the risk-reward equation. I think if in the playoffs they've gotten you here, the ceiling's too high. I got to start Addison and Jeudy. I'm also starting Adam Thielen for sure. I told you to pick him up last week, but I did not endorse starting him against the Eagles. I thought it was too risky, and he proved me wrong. If you actually trusted Thielen, he rewarded you, and at this point, he's a full go. I think you can expect exactly what we saw from him last year to start the season. Bryce Young targets him like crazy. So there's only Xavier Legette to really threaten him, and that's not any concern. Adam Thielen's on fire. He's the wide receiver 17 the last month, averaging 13.3 points, 75 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. I would trust him no matter what. The matchup's top 11. Cowboys give up 170 yards per game. 100 of them should go to Thielen. I trust Thielen a lot in this game. Maybe the touchdown doesn't hit, but the yards will be there. Number 20, I think the touchdown will hit for Davante Adams, but maybe against Jacksonville, there's a fluke situation. Maybe Alan Lazard scores all the touchdowns. I actually did pick the Jags to upset the Jets. I just don't have faith in the Jets. Another Florida game, and I think they will be overlooking this opponent, but I do think Rodgers has kind of locked onto Adams at this point, especially in the red zone. I think they're kind of just going for like record numbers. Like if you look up the most red zone touchdowns between a quarterback and wide receiver combo, or even just touchdowns in general, I feel like Rodgers and Adams have to be at the top of the list, if not like in the top 5 at worst. So I think that's the only thing they're really playing for rest of season. I don't think they give a shit about anything else, and they just want to pad these numbers. I trust Adams in the red zone. Rodgers is getting him the ball, making sure that happens. So I don't really trust anyone else in the Jets offense, but Adams is money in the bank in the red zone. That touchdown is guaranteed. So I would be starting him. He's right behind Thielen, averaging 13.2 points. The wide receiver 18 the last month. Outside the top 20, I still think Brian Thomas Jr. is a stud. Definitely should be starting him in your lineup. High upside with him. He's coming on strong. Even with Mac Jones, he needs to get the ball, and he does, and he plays so well. He was the reason they had anything going against Tennessee last week. They would not have won the game without Brian Thomas on the field. So I trust him a lot. I think he's a big reason why I picked the Jets to lose. Brian Thomas will play very well. I think he finds the end zone. With no Sauce Gardner, no downgrade at all for Brian Thomas, he's getting back in the top 25 very, very rapidly. Number 22, we got Drake London at Las Vegas, and I'm concerned he does not find the end zone. The matchup against Las Vegas, though, is pretty good. They have given up 7 touchdowns the last 5 games, but maybe it goes to Mooney, maybe it goes to Ray McCloud, maybe, just maybe, it goes to Kyle Pitts, and you get screwed with London. But from a floor standpoint, he's been pretty safe. No touchdowns for him the last month. I mentioned I'm worried about it, but he's still going over double-digit points. 10.9 is his average. And from a safety net standpoint, London's bust-proof. I would still keep starting him, but I don't expect a touchdown. I don't think he has top 20 upside this week. Just a high-end flex play. Low-end wide receiver 2. At number 23, I think there's a higher ceiling for Waddle, but it wouldn't shock me if like Jonnu Smith and Tyreek Hill hogged all the production in the end zone away from Waddle. So there's a lot of mouths to feed there. The matchup is top 2, though, and he is a wide receiver 2, so that's why I could not rank him above guys like London, Thomas, and Davante Adams. But he could have just as good of a game as Jordan Addison this week. I see a huge ceiling against the Texans. They are the second best matchup and give up 183 yards. Waddle probably goes over 100. He's been averaging 83 the last month. So if he finds the end zone, you're going to be ecstatic about it, but he's been lights out lately, really climbing up the rankings. And in this matchup, I do trust him. I think Waddle is a very good play against the Texans this week. At number 24, I think Jameson Williams is in the same vein. I expect a shootout in Houston with the Dolphins. I expect another shootout in Detroit with the Bills. So definitely I want a piece of this game, and that's why I have Khalil Shakir right behind him. I think from a ceiling standpoint, it's hard to find a better game to chase than the Bills and Lions matchup this week. So that's why I'm trusting Jameson Williams. He's been really reliable. 80 yards per game the last month, wide receiver 27, only 1 touchdown, and if he breaks a 50-yard house call, he could go over 20 points in this game. So a massive ceiling. We know there are some bad games with him, though. There is a bust potential with JMO, and that's why I just couldn't put him in the top 20. But in the top 25, I would be starting him. He's in my lineup in the subscriber league. He is my flex play. I think I'm going to bench either Pacheco or Garendo based on health for Jameson Williams in my flex spot. Let's go JMO for the win in Week 15 against Buffalo. Number 25, as I mentioned, Khalil Shakir in the same game. Super high floor, a lot of potential in this matchup. He scored that long run after the catch touchdown last week, and usually that doesn't hit, but the floor is always top 30 with Shakir. He's a very reliable player, and I almost always rank him between wide receiver 25 and 30. This week I have him at the high end of that range, and at number 25, he is the last player in this tier. I expect a bust-proof double-digit score from Khalil Shakir. Even without a touchdown, he will give you at least like 5 catches and 75 yards. 10 points, I think, is guaranteed from Shakir. Let's hope for the touchdown. He could go over 20 once again. Moving forward, I think we're in the flex territory for sure. And now, maybe just shoot for upside. The mantra in the playoffs is start your studs. And I think if there was ever a game that Kyle Shanahan has been saving Deebo Samuel for, it would be this week against the Rams. It's a clear win or go home. Even if they win, they could still miss the playoffs, but if they lose, that is the nail in the coffin. There is no chance they can catch the Rams if they lose this week. Their playoff hopes are on the line, and Deebo has been atrocious. The last month, averaging 3.3 points per game. One of those games, though, he fumbled in the snow. That was a write-off. Another game, Brock Purdy wasn't even the quarterback. You can write that off as well. And his average is a lot closer to like 8 points if you only count the games with Purdy. But even that is a bit concerning. It's not great for Deebo. However, if you look at the matchup stats against the Rams, oh, brother, he's going to go off on Thursday. I really believe that's the case. Oftentimes, Shanahan will save a player he's about to showcase the following game, especially if it's a Thursday night matchup. I think it could happen again. Like the last time we saw Jauan Jennings score multiple touchdowns, the other receiver in this offense had an elite game. If you recall, Deebo was out for that Cardinals game. That's why Brandon Ayuk had to step up. So yes, that is exactly what happened. And Deebo's going to go off. So he's been risky. There's a lot of concern here, a lot of red flags just because he's been so ass the last month. But against the Rams, he's averaging 125 yards per game and 5 touchdowns in his last 5 full games against them, and an average of 21.7 points per game, 8 targets, 6.4 catches per game. Deebo's going to go off. I think it might be his last year in San Francisco, and Shanahan is going to go off with a banger. Deebo, I think, will win you your week this week, but obviously the risk is why I can't put him any higher. I want to start the studs, but I have to keep it real. I think Shakir has a much safer floor for double digits, and if you told me Deebo let you down again, I would not be surprised at all. He's been so bad. It is a tough spot. So win or go home. If you made it to the playoffs with Deebo, go ahead and start him. I think this is the game. I wouldn't trust him next week. I think he's going to have a big fall back down right after a huge spike week. But if the spike week's coming, it's this week. So that's why I rank him at 26. I think from a upside standpoint, Deebo is no better than a flex play. I can't put him any higher than the flex rankings. But at 26, he's the best flex play, in my opinion. Number 27, I got Keenan Allen at Minnesota, who's also a really good flex play. And similar to Deebo, it's the matchup stats that have me so bought in. Last year against the Minnesota Vikings as a Charger, he had a passing touchdown to Mike Williams for 49 yards, and that's not even like the best aspect of these stats. In 4 games as a Charger versus Minnesota, Keenan Allen averages 136 yards per game. Obviously, he's not the same player now at this age, but still, he owns Minnesota, and maybe that's one of the reasons why the Bears did trade for him, knowing he torches the Vikings whenever he goes up against them. So it's not a common matchup, the Chargers versus the Vikings, but still he has insane numbers. And even a couple weeks ago, he had 86 yards on 9 catches, 15 targets, and a touchdown with Caleb Williams as the quarterback. So I see a high ceiling for Keenan. He could definitely find the end zone. I expect at least 1 touchdown for Keenan this week. I think he does have a very good game. He is still a top 21 receiver the last month. Last week was a bit bad, but Rome kind of dominated, and I think it pivots back to Keenan in this divisional matchup. I think Keenan has a huge ceiling. I think on name value, you start your studs. Let's trust one of the studs. He's still an insanely good receiver. I think Caleb has a bounce back game. I'm going to put Keenan as a start in the top 30. At number 27, start Keenan this week. Number 28, I would be starting Jakobi Meyers as well. You got to trust Desmond Ridder, so that's why I can't put him where I want to. But this is the best matchup. The Falcons give up 39.9 points per game, almost 40 points available to the position this week against Atlanta. Obviously, it was skewed 5 touchdowns against the Vikings last week and a lot of yards, so maybe it's not that good, but still Jakobi has no other competition. Other than Brock Bowers, there's not a single receiver that threatens him. So Jakobi is getting over 10 targets per game. The volume will be there. I think Jakobi's also a double-digit floor play, but if Bowers plays so well and Ridder just can't get multiple players involved, there is some risk with Jakobi just because of the quarterback situation. I couldn't put him above the tier break. At 28, I am still telling you, start Jakobi Meyers as a high-end flex play. I think he's worth it. At 29, last week, Calvin Ridley was still decent, had 12 targets, but not the game I expected. In a revenge game spot, he did let me down. But against the Bengals, it's an even better matchup, actually. It's still top 5, and I think he will play very well. I think the coach is going to really dial up a great game plan, and Levis won't be stopped. The Bengals defense is a massive upgrade for Levis. So I'm going to trust Ridley from a floor standpoint. The touchdowns have evaded him. Maybe the touchdown still goes to Westbrook-Ikine, but from a floor standpoint, I also think Ridley does offer like 9-10 points most likely. If he does score a touchdown, you'll be very happy. I think Ridley's one of the better flex plays this week just because the matchup against Cincinnati is so good. It ranks top 4. They've given up 8 touchdowns to receivers the last 5 games. At number 30, I think Josh Downs is also a pretty good play. He's averaging 10.2 points with 1 touchdown his last 4 games, and I do expect him to come back off of the injury report after the bye. The matchup against Denver is top 5, but obviously Jerry Jeudy skews these numbers. I am expecting Patrick Surtain to be guarding Michael Pittman. If that's the case, there's some injuries in the Broncos secondary, and Josh Downs could really capitalize. He's their best receiver in the first place. I could be wrong. Maybe Surtain does target him the most, but I think as a slot receiver, I don't think that'll be the case. I think Downs is the safe play. With the Colts, I would start him. I could see an easy touchdown for him, as Surtain is focused on Pittman. But let's hope for the best. As we exit the top 30, we are taking on a bit more risk, but I think Marvin Harrison Jr. still has that high touchdown upside. I'm willing to trust it. He's still that rookie receiver with so much talent. If you don't have a better option, I would put him in the lineup. But at this point, I'm kind of trying to fade him. I'd rather go with a top 30 player. I don't trust the guys outside the top 30 as much as Josh Downs and everyone above. But Malik Nabers in the same conversation. He's questionable, didn't practice on Wednesday, but I think he's going to be fine. I'm not worried about Malik Nabers. I'd still consider him in the same vein as Marvin Harrison. But then DK Metcalf, I think, is due for a touchdown. It's been over a month since he's scored, and I think he's going to have a big game against the Packers on Sunday night. I think he pays off. So there is some risk. He's been underperforming, averaging less than Nabers and Harrison, but still in the flex rankings. I think there is a high ceiling for Metcalf this week. Worth starting if you need him. Number 34, obviously there's also some upside with Garrett Wilson, but no touchdowns for him, and I'm not expecting them to come back. I think Davante Adams will get the only touchdown if there's only one available for the Jets. And I kind of feel like Lazard could vulture him as well now that he's back. I have some concerns with Wilson. I don't think Rodgers is going to force feed him the ball. I don't think there's any reason for Rodgers to care about Garrett Wilson's fantasy numbers. So kind of risky, but the floor is probably safe for at least 8 points. That's his average the last month. But Jayden Reed is very boom bust. Last week was a bagel, so odds are he bounces back, but how much do you trust him with Romeo Doubs coming back and Christian Watson coming on? As Jacobs scores almost every touchdown, it feels like, I could see another rough game for Jayden Reed. But the ceiling's obviously massive. Last week did not make you feel comfortable, though. I think I'd rather bench him at 35. He's still in the flex conversation, but definitely risky. I'd probably pass. But he could easily bounce back. I wouldn't be shocked if he got 20 points from Jayden Reed. And then Zay Flowers wouldn't shock me if he went over 100 yards, but he has been pretty rough. Only the wide receiver 58 over his last 4 games, and the Giants are actually a bottom 4 matchup. The Giants are actually very tough. Flowers is not that safe, and I see a huge game for Derrick Henry, Justice Hill, as the Giants are atrocious against the run. So Flowers, pretty risky, just like Jayden Reed and Garrett Wilson. I don't feel great about it, but if it did happen where they won you the week, wouldn't be shocked at all. This flex range, 26 to 38 in the rankings, there is league-winning upside with every player. There's also league-losing risk as well. Flowers has been on the riskier side as of late, but he probably bounces back, most likely. At 37, Keon Coleman, if he does play, I think is a must start. He's been really good when healthy, but not a guarantee. That wrist injury has kept him off the field for quite some time. But if he doesn't suit up, then Amari Cooper would be a massive riser. Assuming they both play, I think they're both still really good flex plays at 37, 38. They are still in that range. I could rank either of them at 26, like right behind Khalil Shakir. Every player from Deebo down to Amari Cooper all kind of slot in here. They're all kind of equally as high upside ceiling type of guys, but obviously they're not the go-to target, and you never know, like, guaranteed which one will actually score that touchdown. But maybe there's enough for everyone to score. Maybe Josh Allen, though, scores another 3 rushing touchdowns and caps the ceiling once again. So those are the flex plays. I think I'd rather be starting them than like a running back outside my top 30. And I really see like still some week winning potential for all of these players, but there is some risk with every single one I just mentioned. Good luck if you're starting them. But then outside this line, now we're really getting a little bit more desperate, and there is a world, but I think in these situations, I'd probably pass on them this week. I think there's just too many better options to trust these guys. But Cedric Tillman is super interesting. There's so much upside in that Browns passing game. Tillman has played very well when healthy, and I think he comes back from the concussion. Against the Chiefs, it's also a top 3 matchup. Maybe they do lock down Jeudy. If Tillman is the guy, I wouldn't be shocked. But I do think he's better than Elijah Moore. When he comes back, he'll be the number 2 behind Jeudy. Tillman, I think, might be even above David Njoku for Jameis Winston. But number 40, I think DeAndre Hopkins is in for a rough week this week. Against Denzel Ward and the Browns, it's not great. And Hopkins has been a little touchdown dependent in general. There's just too many weapons in that Chiefs offense to like trust Hopkins as a obvious start. He's not as valuable as Rashee Rice, and he's barely more valuable than Xavier Worthy. So he's been tied for wide receiver 38 the last month, and he has scored 2 touchdowns. He's giving you less than 50 yards per game on average, and I don't trust him like crazy. I'd probably bench Hopkins against Denzel Ward this week. But number 41, Christian Watson, is very tempting, but he has no touchdowns, however, 84 yards on average, and he is the wide receiver 40 over the last month himself. But with Romeo Doubs coming back and maybe Jayden Reed due for a bounce back situation, I think Watson is a bit of a liability. If he finds the end zone, he will be insane this week. However, are you really going to trust it? Watson is one of those huge coin flips, and if you're willing to trust it, it might pay off, but it could burn you. I did pick Seattle to win on Sunday night. I think the Packers have a rough time in Seattle there. But number 42, a player we've been trusting for a long time, is Darnell Mooney. However, no touchdowns for him the last month. Kirk Cousins not throwing almost any of them. He has way more interceptions than touchdowns. On Monday night, I'd like to trust Mooney, but I'm not willing to do it. The Raiders are a good matchup, but similar to Christian Watson, without the touchdown, you probably don't go over 10 points, and it probably burns you. But 43, Xavier Worthy is going to be involved, but just like DeAndre Hopkins, like, there's just too many mouths to feed. I don't feel great about starting a Chiefs receiver with confidence. So going to pass. I'm also going to pass on Davante Smith this week. He's been bad, the wide receiver 48 the last month, and that does include 2 touchdowns, just like DeAndre Hopkins. There's name value. There's a chance for a touchdown, but without it, you get screwed. I would probably bench Davante Smith. I expect a big game for A.J. Brown and Saquon. I don't expect a big one for Davante. Number 45, maybe Tank Dell can pay off, but he's been so bad. He's barely been better than John Mechie the last month in fantasy. So off the bye, perhaps he bounces back, but he's just been so atrocious. I can't endorse him. Can't tell you to start Tank Dell. But against the Dolphins, maybe it does happen if Ramsey does lock up Nico Collins a little bit. But are you really going to do it in the fantasy playoffs? I don't think so. He's been so terrible this year. I'm also not going to start Nick Westbrook-Akine in the fantasy playoffs. After the touchdown streak was snapped last week, I will move off it. But the Bengals are a very good matchup. They have given up 8 touchdowns the last 5 games. If you wanted to bet on it, I would understand. But you know exactly what you're betting on. It's very risky if it doesn't work out and you just need the touchdown. Even with it, you might only get like 9 points, and it's still not that worth it. So I'm going to pass on Westbrook-Akine. I'm not going to bet on the touchdown in week 15. But then beyond this point, we're just hoping for like that fluke touchdown. There's a world where any of these guys have a massive game, but after last week, it probably doesn't happen to Tim Patrick. Once again, it's possible, but it probably goes to Amon-Ra and Jamo this week. I'm going to pass on Tim Patrick. But then the 2 Chargers receivers are very interesting. The Tampa Bay matchup, going to require them to score, and with no Ladd McConkey most likely, I didn't rank Ladd. I don't expect him to play. QJ and Palmer could step up like they did last week. The Bucs don't scare you in the secondary. At 50, we got Michael Pittman at Denver, who probably gets Patrick Surtain, so I'm going to pass on him. He's not been safe either this season. It's been Alec Pierce and Josh Downs. Very few spike weeks for Michael Pittman. Hard to predict when they come. Elijah Moore maybe retains that number 2 job, but I expect Cedric Tillman back, so I'm not going to start Elijah Moore. I would trust Tillman more than Moore. A lot. Number 52, I got Rome Odunze. He had 2 touchdowns last week, but I expect that to pivot back to Keenan and DJ. I'll pass on Rome. And then Romeo Doubs right behind him should come back off the concussion, but in primetime, he doesn't have any touchdowns lately, and there's also kind of too many mouths to feed. I don't trust the Packers receivers too much with him back on the field. Josh Jacobs is vulturing all the touchdowns, but then outside the top 53, these last 7 players, they're kind of like honorable mentions. There's a chance they work out, but I'm going to definitely bench them this week. But who knows? They could be those DFS flyers that really piss us off in season long. We got MVS here at 54. And against Marshawn Lattimore, I'm not going to start him. Lattimore is going up against his former team, and I think MVS is a major bust candidate. The regression is coming. I don't trust MVS this week. Number 55, I don't trust Allen Lazard, but maybe against Jacksonville, he really is the reason why Garrett Wilson doesn't work out this week. I could envision a touchdown for Lazard very easily. I think Rodgers will probably target him and Adams more than he targets Garrett Wilson in the red zone. So that could be annoying, but we'll see. If you are willing to trust it, be my guest. I would love to see Lazard in my opponent's lineup, and I'd take that bet. against Lazard, I'm telling you to bench him this week. And then at 56, we have Jalen McMillan, who also scored 2 touchdowns last week and could pop off, but I doubt it. I'm only going to trust Evans this week. Good matchup, though. 57, we have Alec Pierce at Denver, and kind of the same situation. You're hoping for the house call. Maybe it hits. Demario Douglas at Arizona. Floor play, I don't trust any Patriots receivers, but Demario has been the more reliable one, averaging 7 points per game. No touchdown, though, is ever expected from Demario. And then at 59, I have Noah Brown at New Orleans, and maybe it doesn't all go to Terry McLaurin. There has to be somebody else other than Ertz to step up for Jayden Daniels. Off the bye, maybe Noah Brown does work out against the Saints. And then lastly, Calvin Austin is technically the starting receiver for the Steelers this week that I am ranking. Have to mention him, but Mike Williams, I think, probably gets Quinion Mitchell. I think Calvin Austin gets Cooper DeJean, and if one of them has a long house call, I would bet on Calvin Austin. That's the only way it works out. I wouldn't trust it, though. The Eagles are a big downgrade. I will pass with no George Pickens. So that's it for the rankings. Here are the top 60 here on the screen, and I feel like the top 7 are all locks in your lineup, the true elite difference makers. You cannot bench any of those wide receiver 1s. And then wide receivers 8 through 16, that is the elite wide receiver 2s, the high-end options that obviously you have to start. I think they've just been so productive based on name value and just stud level production. They are locks in your lineup. I expect 18 to 20 plus for the top 7 and 15 plus for the top 16. But 17 through 25, I think, are all going to go over 11, 12 points. I think they're all safe for double digits. The guaranteed low-end wide receiver 2s. Maybe there's some players later on that have more of a ceiling, but I think from a floor standpoint, these options are bust-proof. And from a start-your-studs mentality, I could not bench any of these names. I think they're all way too productive, way too valuable at the moment to be benching, and they are in my lineup above this next tier. Deebo Samuel at wide receiver 26, all the way down to wide receiver 38 with Amari Cooper, I think are all kind of interchangeable. They all have massive, massive upside this week with a little bit of risk. And I think the first week of the playoffs, one of these players will be a league winner, and a handful of them probably lose you your week. But after that, Cedric Tillman through Nick Westbrook and Keenan all have also a legit argument to be made why you should be starting them. There's also some high-end upside, but a little too much risk at this point. I think I'm going to pass based on the circumstances for all of them. Just a little too risky this week. I'm going to avoid them in the playoffs. And then starting with Tim Patrick, you're just praying for touchdowns. It's all just a dart throw at that point. You might as well put a blindfold on and just pick one randomly out of a hat. So that's it for the receiver rankings, my top 60. And if you still have any questions, go ahead and leave me a comment down below. I'll be happy to answer them before kickoff. But that's it for me. My name is Adam Riancho. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching Nice and Blunt.